All right, good morning. Welcome to Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually, for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan Klein-Hewitt, Adult Services Manager here at Ames Public Library. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like today's event. For those of you with us in person, you probably saw some updated signage when you came in today. So with the increase in local community infections, the library and other city buildings is asking customers to socially distance or mask when they are not able to. This room is equipped with an induction loop for the benefit of hearing aid users. To use that, please switch your hearing aid to T. We also have a hearing aid assist device that we can lend you. For those of you with us virtually, we'll be muting your microphones during the presentation, so please submit any questions you have via the chat function. We will also be able to ask you to unmute at the end of the presentation and ask your questions live if you would prefer to do that. If you get bumped out of the Zoom meeting, just follow the original link back and you'll be able to get right back in. And we have or will enable live captioning. So if you don't see captions here in a moment, turn them on by clicking the CC Live Transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. For everyone, today's session is being recorded and will be posted to Ames Public Library's YouTube channel after the event, and we will have time for questions at the end. So as I said, if you're on Zoom, you can wait until the end and unmute yourself, or if you're with us live, a staff member will come around with a microphone to ask you to let you ask your questions. So with that, please welcome Gwyneth Jacobson and Mary Laura.
Okay, we're going to talk about the U.S. Census today, and I'll be doing the census that have already been published, and Mary will be doing a talk later about the 1950 census. Okay, the census was started, as part of our Constitution. So it's, the Constitution empowers the Congress to carry out the census. And it was to begin within 3 years of the first meeting of Congress. So they started in 1790. It was conducted every 10 years from then. And it was collected to determine the representatives that we need for Congress. This was a new form of government, a democracy. So you needed to be able to know how many representatives you got to represent you. And it's used for all types of purposes then and now, as your city grows or whatever, people use the data that they get from the census. And it was carried out the first time by the Secretary of State, who was Thomas Jefferson, and he used federal marshals to carry out the census. And then sometime, I think about 1849, it's kind of moved over to the Department of the Interior. In 1902 and 3, it got moved to the Department of Commerce and Labor, and those two split up to Commerce Department and Labor Department, and so it stayed under the Department of Commerce where it is now. Okay. This is kind of what I'm going to be covering. So the date that I'm going to show you, the dates that it was conducted, the questions that were asked, and examples from history. Those all come from ancestry.com, and the questions come from the census.gov. And then afterwards, I'll show you a timeline sort of what the changes in the census. And then where to find these censuses online, and blank forms that you can fill out with the information, and where to learn more about the particular census records or year. Some search hints: if you're trying to search, you can't find it, what you should try, and how to use an important part for genealogy is how to use the census information to find other records. And then, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about non-population schedules, like death or veterans schedules or agricultural census. And I'll show you an example of one, and we'll talk about state and territory census. Okay, this is when the census was conducted. It started out in August from 1790 to 1820. It moved to June was the date. And then then in 1910, they tried it in April and January. And then I think they decided that April was better than June because people aren't on vacation in April. And this is also I put up the population there so you could see how the country has grown over that period of time from 1790 to 1940, over 150 years. Okay, this is just general categories. I took this off the 1900 census. So when you look at these questions, they fall into the following categories. You have the location, you have the name, you know, and the description, personal stuff like your race, sex, age, married, number of children. And then you have nativity, where were you born, where were your parents born, citizenship, so like what, if you immigrated, if you are an immigrant, what year you immigrated, what year you were naturalized, occupation, what occupation you might have had, education, and ownership of your home. And then these weren't in the 1900s, but there was some census that asked military questions and health questions. So this is kind of all the categories that I kind of want you to look for when you look at the questions and categorize them. Okay, the first census, 1790. This was conducted, they just did a head of household. They didn't list everybody in the house, and then but the people in the house, they listed them by age category, under 16, over 16 for male, and just one count of all the females in the house. And then if you had any other people living with you, or if you had slaves living with you. Okay, here's the example. This is John Adams, and John Adams, he had himself, it looks like himself, his wife, and a child under 16. So that would be John Quincy Adams would be my guess. And this was in Braintree, Massachusetts, that he was living in 1790. And this one has headers on it, so this is nice. The questions are across the top, but they didn't really have printed forms, standard printed forms until that were uniform until 1840 or 1830, I should say. 1830 is when they started having the same forms across the top of the page on every form that they did. This one they just they made it up. The marshals made it up, or whoever was taking the census. So from 1830 to 1840, there was printed uniform schedules with the headings in the top, but you're still only the head of the household was named up until 1840. Okay, in 1800, it looks pretty much the same, but they've categorized the ages different. So you have several categories for what ages people fall into. And you also list females by those age categories too. So that's the main difference. And the location, it might not be at the top of every page. It might be on the page at the start of the county and then at the end of the county. Here's Alexander Hamilton living in New York, Ward 1. And he has a large family here. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, he didn't have that many kids, so this might be like 2 families. You don't know because there's just tick marks, you know, count numbers. And at the end, I think the 4 is the people that are not white, the non-white people. So 14 living in the house. Okay, in 1810, it was pretty much the same categories, but so it's pretty much the same. This is Thomas Jefferson living in Virginia, probably at Monticello, and I don't know, you have to measure all the tick marks. Some of these, This is kind of light. I can't read the numbers on here, but if you get a different copy of it, you can get a darker version, but then you can't read the name. So there's a couple of different versions you can get of that. The archives is the one that has, I noticed that archives has a darker copy of it. Okay, this is the 1820. It's real similar. They might have added some more categories for ages, but they've added one category, and I kind of think of it might be a military category because they want to know every male that's 16 years of age but under 18 for males only. And this was a second count, so they were counted twice. They were counted here and they were counted in the 16 to 26 category too. And now they're starting to categorize the people of color, the enslaved people. And then they've added whether there's a foreigner that's living in the house and how many foreigners you have and how many and what occupation they have. And here's the example, James Monroe. Now this one, somebody has written out the headers at the top of the page, so that's nice, the questions. But I didn't put them down there where I expanded it for you. Living in Washington, DC, so he's probably in the presidency right then. In the 1830-40 census, they expanded it a whole bunch, the categories. And then they have categories for free of each sex. Both free and slaves. And then these are additional questions they might ask. These are health questions. Whether you're blind, whether you're deaf. And then they also still ask the number of people that were foreigners and not naturalized, non-citizens. So I have James Madison here. Now, James Madison, you see it goes, there's a page break there, so it's 2 pages long. All those extra categories, they had to make it longer. So always when you look at censuses, you want to make sure that you know if there's one or more pages, so go forward a page and backwards a page, see if there's multiple pages. And he's living in Orange, Virginia this time. And this is the 1840, and it's similar to the 1830, the first part, but the second part, they started asking whether the people were pensioners of the Revolutionary War, what occupations they were in, the health questions. And then I think these college questions were at the end of the counties or someplace. I don't think they were, you can't ask those questions of an individual, so. Those are education questions, so these are education thing. This is John Quincy Adams. He's now in Quincy, Massachusetts. And what I say here is Braintree and Quincy. I think Quincy was broken off from Braintree, so he might be living in the same house that his father was living in the 1790 census that we looked at. So it's always important to know what boundary changes occurred. So when you're looking at census, you want to know, is this the same place as the last one and just the boundary changed, but it's still the same place? And I don't know this for sure, it's the same place, but it could be. Okay, the 1850 census. This is when everybody in the household that was free was listed. So, and they asked your place of birth. So it's the first time you know that. And was the person married within the year? So, I mean, the other question, name, age, sex, location, profession.
Lena,
Yeah.
can you define free? Sometimes it's called free and other times it's not.
Okay. I think when they say free, they mean free and non-white.
Free what?
Free non-whites. So like a black person that is free. But they don't, because most of the categories are white people. So when they say free, they mean non-white people.
No, because sometimes it said free white males and free white females.
Okay. Well, then if it says white, that's what it means. Because they
What
were,
does free mean?
free means they're not enslaved.
Okay.
So I think it would include your servants and your, maybe even your indentured servants. The Indians, they didn't do regular counts of the Indians until later. So it wouldn't be Indians unless they were living within the confines of within the white people's community rather than on a reservation. So I got Abraham Lincoln here. You can see his wife and his children, but they're not identified as his wife and children. We just know this. And he's an attorney at law, and he was born in Kentucky, and his wife was born in Kentucky, and they're now living in Illinois. Let me go back. Okay, this one is the slaves. This 1850 and 1816, they had slave schedules. So everybody that's enslaved would be listed on here. And they didn't list them by name. They put them by the name of the owner and gave them a number. Although I just watched Henry Louis Gates' show on PBS, and he said there were 3 counties that had the names listed of the slaves. So there was a person on his show that happened to be, his ancestor was in that county, that she had the names of her ancestor. Okay. The 1860, they had a couple more questions. The value of your real estate. I kind of highlighted in green so we don't go through all the questions individually. And this is the slave schedule again. It's the same as the 1850 and 60 slave schedules look exactly alike. And this is Ulysses S Grant. And here's a close-up of it. And you see, he's listed by his initials. So when you're looking up your relatives, you should, and you can't find them, you should look them up by initials perhaps, because they're listed by initials. And right here, it says he's a leather merchant, I think. So he went from, in 1860, being a leather merchant to being the head of the general of the Civil War, and then as president. So he, you know, he had quite a meteoric rise. Okay, here, the 1870, they ask if your parents, what your parents, if your parents were foreign, not what nationality they were. They just list if they were foreign, and then they have they list the age as a fraction for an infant. So So 19 and 20 are kind of interesting because those are about voting. Are you eligible to vote? And were you denied or abridged the grounds to vote? I never knew that was in there, but 1870 was at the time they were passing those amendments to allow enslaved people to vote, formerly enslaved people that were not newly freed to vote. So they asked this question to figure out if they were being denied the opportunity to vote. And here's Benjamin Harris. I don't know if there's something I wanted to say about that. Benjamin Harris actually had 2 copies in this, 2 census copies. So he was at 2 different locations and was, this is Indianapolis. I think they're both in Indianapolis somewhere. Okay, the 1880, this is the first one, where it gives the relationship to the head of the household. So you know for sure if it's the wife, it's the son, it's a granddaughter, it's a brother, you know for sure the relationship to the head of the household. And then ask you more questions about if you're single, if you're married or widowed or divorced. In addition to being married, you can put in a W or D. And was the person married in the last year? So if you're trying to look up a wedding, a marriage certificate, you would know this person, if they were listed here as being married that year, what year to look for their marriage certificate. And then 25 and 26, the place of birth of the father, the place of birth of the mother. So that's, you can trace them back to the state or country that they're from. And this is Rutherford B. Hayes. Well, this is where he's president of the US. So that's his occupation, president of the United States. And here's an enlargement of the Rutherford B. Hayes and all the, the servants that work with him. And over on the left, you can see it's usually the street name. Here it says Executive Grounds, Pennsylvania Avenue. So I blew it up so you could read it on here. But it is to the left of all these people's names. So 1880 made a lot of new questions, a lot of extra questions. So you can see where he was born here. Let me go back one. Well, you can see the relationship, their wife, daughter, son. Well, I don't have where he was born or his parents were born, but I have it for the servants. And you can see there's people born in Prussia and Ireland and Kentucky and Ohio and Scotland. So you can see all these, where these people were born. Okay, the 1890 census is kind of, was destroyed by fire in 1921. So it was taken in 1890 and before, it became public, it was destroyed. And after it was destroyed, they started funds for an archive building. So we have a National Archives, in part, I think, due to this destruction of this census. And in 1933, like 10 years later, they ordered it destroyed. And then after that time, when it was destroyed, they found a few remaining piles of information in the archives. So, but it's less than 1% of the total. So about 6,000 people out of the total. And you can see they asked lots more questions on this. And well, the 1900 kind of has some of these same questions too. But I won't spend a lot of time on this because basically there's only 6,000 people that we have records of. So, but at the top of the page, they had some questions along the top row, and at the bottom of the flip side of the page, they had more. And I found one example here of the 1890 census. And this person is named Martha H. Harlan. And this is from Mound, McDonough, Illinois. And she was a widow. She was a widow, Confederate widow. So they named if you were a soldier in the war, what kind of soldier you were. And also they listed how many children you had born and how many were living. And part 9 there, the question 9 there, she had 9 children born to her and 7 were living. And then her sons, if you looked at the place of birth of the father are 2 different places. So either this is a mistake or these 2 sons had different fathers because their fathers were born in different locations. So the interesting thing about this, I think, is that all the questions are on the left-hand side and all the people are across the top. So it's just the opposite of all the other census that we have. It's the only census done like this. And you flip the page and the other half of the family would be on the other page. If she had 7 kids, if they're all there, take 2 pages. And you can see A, B, C, D, E at the top. And then if you flipped it over at the bottom, you'd have the questions. Okay, the 1900 census. The new questions that were asked here, you can get the date of birth for the month and the year. So it's very close to the birth date of the person. This is the only one, this is the only census, federal census that I know that this was asked of. So to get the birth date, this would be the one to look at. And then how many years had the person been married? And for mothers, they asked this question again, how many children have you had and how many are living? So you would know, you might find children in here that died as babies, so they aren't listed on any census, but you do know because you have a list of how many children they actually had at this time and how many were still living. And then number 16 is the year of immigration to the United States. So if you're looking for immigration records, this is a great place to start that search. And how many years were in the United States? And is the person naturalized? So those are all immigration questions. Okay. This was a census done for the Indians. And this was only done after, see, because the questions start at 29. So this was like additional questions that were asked. They answered the first part, and then here they answered these additional parts. If they were a ration Indian or had an R by their name, they would, and those are probably people living on reservations, I would assume. So you would find the tribe of your father and mother here if you were an Indian. Okay, this is Theodore Roosevelt. He's my example for the 1900 census. And at this time he is living in New York. So his job was governor of New York. You can see the street on the left, Cove Neck. And he was governor. Number of children was 6, number of living was 6. And it tells you how many years they were married, 17, it looks like. And the important part, he was born in October of 1858. She was born in August of 1861. So you can see in columns, I don't know what the question number was, but under personal descriptor, like 9, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The 1910s are similar to the 1900. They've added more characteristics for if you're married, you're single, widowed, divorced. This is your first marriage or not your first marriage. So M1 would be first marriage, M2 would be second marriage. And they asked if you had been in the Union or Confederate Army. And then they had the Indian schedule too. This is, if you're Indian, this is the additional questions you'd be asked. So William Taft is who I picked out for the 1910 census. So 15 and 16 over there, they have the year that they immigrated and whether they were naturalized. And I think if you have an A, you're an alien. Sometimes you have a P for your filed the first papers and an NA for naturalized. Okay, 1920. So these must be all similar questions that have already been asked. Here they asked what your mother spoke, what your father spoke, in a native tongue, what they spoke when they were born, I guess. So not do you speak English, but what was your native tongue that you spoke when you were learning to speak? And I've got Woodrow Wilson. And he is president at this time. On the left, you can see Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. And you can see all the nationalities of the people that worked there. And you can see when they became, when they immigrated and when they were naturalized. There's a, up in the middle. Okay, the 1930, they had a couple of new questions. The radio, whether you had a radio set in your house, this was new technology. And they wanted to know how, how it was being used, how many people had it, what percentage, and also the age at your first marriage. So this would be a clue if you've been married twice, if the marriage is. Herbert Hoover. So this is our Iowan, our president born in Iowa. Can I move that? You have to do it with the pad. It's not trying to touch. It's trying to touch it. Some of them you can just pull it, drag it, move it.
You should just be able to click that X. Yeah, let's see. There you go.
So I just wanted to, so you could see that he was born in Iowa. We all know that, but we want to honor him. His parents were born in Ohio and Canada. His mother was Canadian. He's president of the United States here. You can see his son, that's listed here. They have him as an immigrant, but he didn't really immigrate. He was American born abroad. So they crossed that out. 1909, that nationalized. And he was a student at Harvard University. So most of them, I guess they have people from Ireland and Scotland, and Serbia, one person from Serbia. So the 1940 census, this is the last one, that's the federal census. And this was right after the Great Depression. So they wanted to know, there's a great movement of people. So they wanted to know where people lived in 1935 so they could see, I assume that's why they asked those questions. People have moved and they asked a lot of employment questions. And this was the first census where they did a sampling. So these are all the employment questions, but they had supplementary questions, and these are the sampling questions for veterans and people with Social Security. They asked us, and for women who are or have been married. So they ask about the marriage of women. So they have all these supplemental questions. And you can tell on this picture, this is Ronald Reagan, another person with an Iowa connection. You can see the two dashed lines above his name and below his name. Those are the ones they asked the sample questions of. And then at the bottom of the page, those two lines at the very bottom, those are the questions they asked and the answers to those sample questions. So just two people on the page asked those questions. Okay, and this is Ronald Reagan. It says he lived in Des Moines in 1935. He was born in Illinois. So this is a larger picture of it. You can see he worked for the movie industry, motion picture production. There's a Jane has an X by her name. That means that she's the one that answered all the questions. So everything that was written down, she was the one the census taker interviewed to answer these questions. And you can see he made over $5,000 a year in income. So that was probably, the max that they would put down would be 5,000. So he was making some good money, I guess, as an actor and actress. And they were living out there in Los Angeles, Hollywood. Okay, that's, all I'm going to talk about for the federal census. I kind of put together a timeline of some of these we already talked about, who was in control. Started out under the Secretary of State. Went to the Department of the Interior at some point, I think maybe 1849. And then 1902 and 1903, it moved over to the Department of Commerce and Labor. And in 1913, it became the Census Bureau, and it stayed with the Department of Commerce where it is now. And this talks about the fire, it's just interesting details of the history of the census. Okay, this is an interesting article I came across when I was researching this talk. In 2021, they found a lost census from 1810. And somebody knew where it was, but they didn't know what it was because it was in a museum, and somebody posted a picture of it online, and another person looked at it and says, that looks like the census, and it's a missing census. And so now they've got it in Washington, D.C., where the Archives Department has it, National Archives has it. This is an article, and I give you the full URL, so if you want to read more about it, you can read it at that URL. So this is more history. And this included Salem, Massachusetts. So up until this time, people that were looking for their ancestors in Salem, Massachusetts, they wouldn't be able to find them in 1810. Now it's about 2,000 records total. It's about 100 pages they found, and it's about 2,000 and some records, a little over 2,000. This is about some of the technology. I just picked one out. This was the first time that punch cards were used. It was used by Herman Hollerith, invented this. They had a contest to see how they could process the data faster, and he came up with a way of doing it. And this, I give you the URL here if you're interested in this. This stuff fascinates me, so I would encourage you to go read that. And he created a company from this. It was business machines. But anyway, it later became IBM. So from this punched cards, tabulating data, IBM was created by this Herman Hollerith. Later became IBM. And there was, he wanted to charge too much money after he did this in the 1890 census. That was the first time it was used. So there was another guy at the Census Bureau, his name is James LeGrand Powers, and he invented a way to do it so they didn't have to use Herman Hollerith's company. And it was called, and then he started his own company. It's called the Powers Accounting Machine Company. And then that was bought out by Remington Rand, Remington the razor, make the razors. And then that was bought out by Sperry Corporation. So it was called Sperry Rand for a long time. And then I think in 1986, it was merged with Burroughs, and it eventually became Unisys. So these high-tech companies all got started, with the census. And everybody wants to know what happens to the 1890 census. And there's 3 articles that were written, and they're online, and you can read them. It explains from contemporary art, articles. This person went back and researched it and wrote these articles of what happened to the census. And not only the 1890 census disappeared, there was a Union Veterans and Widows census, special census that was taken, a veteran schedule, and half of those disappeared. So I think, you know, from the A countries, Alabama, wherever, to Kentucky, those, you know, only part of Kentucky remains. Those are all lost. And from Kentucky to whatever the last name of the country state is, those still survive. And I don't think they exactly know what happened to them, but they speculate that when they got rid of the 1890 census, they got rid of some of the veteran schedules too. Okay, now where can you find these records? And I'm going to tell you, Family Search is free, so that might be the best place to start. Ancestry.com, you have to have a subscription, but the Ames Public Library here has the library edition. So if you come to the library, you can search for those records here. And there's a couple other ones, Find My Past, My Heritage, those are paid. The next one is a list of other places, and it's part of the Family Search Wiki. So it's just an explanation of where you might find other census online or offline. When I first started, you know, you used to get printouts for the whole county, or you go to the library and they'd have microfilm tapes of the census, and that's where you look for them. But now, you know, they're online, so that's where most people look for them. And then the blank forms, you know, you can't read the headers. If you've noticed, you can't always read the headers. Sometimes the headers don't exist. So these blank forms have all the headers on them. So if you want to convert whatever you found to these forms, you can use blank forms. And here's just, you know, they're all over, but here's just 3 places where you can find these forms to fill out. Ancestry.com, Midwest Genealogy Center. And well, the other one again is a list of other places at the Family Search Wiki, Family Search Research Wiki. So it's a URL to that page. Okay, to find out more about the census, here's some places you can look. I've also given you a 1-page, well, it's 2 pages, front and back, of resources that are all online that you can look up, and you can find out more about studies about census. The one at the bottom is not online. It's a book. It's called The Map Guide to the U.S. Federal Census. And I told you the boundaries change all the time and the counties change all the time. And so if you want to know where it's located, this is a map, and they have a map for every year of the census and what was in the census. So I would recommend this book. These are just some search hints because sometimes you don't find them. And I already, when you're searching for your family, you start at what you know, yourself, your parents, your grandparents, you go backwards in time. So start at the 1940, or when the 1950 comes out in April, start with the 1950 and work backwards from there with your family. Also, you have more relatives as you go backwards. You have your parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. So you get bigger as you go out. And, you know, you can start with a simple search, you know, your name, your year of birth, place of birth, and the current location. You know, you fill that in and look for these people. And if you don't find them, you can try different names of the, you know, spellings, because not always spelled correctly or written down correctly, or if somebody's reading it, they didn't read it correctly, the transcriber. So you can use wildcards, you know, if you can't find it. And if you can't find the person you're looking for and you know a family member, especially if they have an unusual name, you can try searching for them. And we've already said Ulysses S Grant. He used his initials, so you can try initials, you can try middle names. Sometimes people go by their middle names. And, you know, look for neighbors that might be the same. That's a good thing to look for after you find them. A lot of people have the same name, so to make sure it's yours, you know, are they in the right location? Do they have the right family members? You know, you can look and make sure they're the correct person. And those first few sentences, they just had the head of household, and then they just had tick marks for people that, existed, numbers, one person, two persons, and what sex they were. So you're gonna have to compare those sentences with other records that you have to figure out who those people are. And just remember, the census taker could have written it wrong, or a transcriber could have, read it wrong. And this is just an example of how to find a video class online if you're wanting to do more research on how to do census. This is just, I used to go to the Help Center to find all the videos that were online, and you can still do that. You go to the Help Center and you can do it, but it doesn't have a list of the classes anymore at the Help Center. So that's what I found out when I did this class. The way I used to do it doesn't work anymore. So now you can go to this wiki page right here, and you can find all the classes that they have in the Learning Center. And they're not categorized, so you just have to search this page. And here's an example of one of the classes I found, how to find research techniques and strategies. It's actually how to find people when you can't find them. Why couldn't they find them? An example, he had example after example after example of hard to find people that he was searching for and how he ended up finding them. So it's techniques for how to find people that are, not very easy to find. And he had a handout for this. So I would recommend this video if you want to some more search strategies. If you can't find them and you want to try some new ways of finding them. Okay, genealogists want to use all these records to find other records. You want to find birth records, marriage records, passenger lists. So you look at these questions and which ones apply, and you find out what year they were taken. And naturalization, passenger lists, if you want to find out where they came from, the military records. There's 1910 Civil War. Oh. 1930 vet of which war, 1870 vet schedule. Well, 1890 vet schedule. So one I'd look at too. So you can find where their farm was. You can locate it on a map. You can look for the house. You can find out if there's some children you didn't know about, maybe. You can find employment records or school records if you know what type of position, occupation they had. Okay, the non-population schedules. These are the ones, maybe they weren't the ones taken every 10 years. They had an agricultural schedule, the defective schedule, an Indian schedule. We talked about the Indian. Institutions and manufacturing, I don't use those, but they had those. Merchant seamen in 1930. The mortality schedule I have used. And if your ancestor happened to die the year before they took the census in 1850 to 1880, and your state happened to do this mortality schedule, you'll find the name of your ancestor that died the year before the census and what they died of. And the slave schedule, social statistics schedule, veteran schedule. That's what I'm going to show you an example of the 1890. And so Alabama to Kansas are all lost, and part of Kentucky is lost. So Iowa is not there. So if you have an Iowa relative that was in the Civil War, you're not going to find the record for that. But you're not going to find them in the census record for that. And so here's an example of the veteran schedule. This is Rutherford B. Hayes. It lists his rank, his brigadier general, his company, then his regiment, his enlistment date. Those are in the long row. The discharge date, the length of his service. And then below that, it will list his post office address and what disability you have, and any other remarks below that long one that I've highlighted there. Okay, now state census, there's a page here where you can go and look and see what, these are links and you can go to your state, or you can just find the state in the wiki, the research wiki for family search. And I did the Iowa Census, and there's a wiki page for that too. It's called Iowa Census. This is the URL. And the years available for the Iowa Census, that both the family search and the ancestry, 1925, 1915, 1905, 1895, 1885, and 1856. Now there's other census that are listed at that URL, so you can go look at them. And most of them are in this database on Ancestry, US State Census Collection 1836 to 1925. And I just give you the address, the URL for that too. So you can either go to the wiki page or you can go directly to Ancestry and try to find these. And these are searchable, browsable, not searchable, browsable by year and location. So there's a way that you can search these, because it's a big database. They mushed everything into one database. So you don't know if what there is available, you can look for it by year and location. Okay, then here's a second sample of the 1925 Iowa Census. And this one, the 1925 census has the name of your father and the name of your mother. So this is the only census that I know in the country that has this. Full maiden name of your mother and the place of birth where they were born and the place of their marriage. And this happens to be my ancestor, so not a president thing. This is George Studley, and his father's name was William Studley, and his mother's name was Eunice. It says, I think Eunice Moore, her last name was Timmerman. I think her stepfather was Moore. So, and he was born in England and she was born in Ohio, and they were married in Illinois. Okay. This is his second wife. So this is not my great grandmother. It is his second wife, Eliza, on here. But there was 3 pages to this. So first page is, the regular stuff. Second page has the names of his parents. Third page, I think, was veterans and religion and some other stuff. But as again, if you have a census, make sure you know all the pages that exist. So go backwards and forwards. Make sure you have all the pages. And this is the page in line. And you can see here the 2 lines on the page. Those are shorter pages. So like the first page has the name of the person, and then there's 2 shorter pages. And so when you flip them over, it lines up perfectly with the name of the person. Well, you can't really see that too well here, but I think that's the way it worked. They filmed it, they just flipped it open. But on the left is from the page before. This is the middle page where George Studley's parents are, and Eliza Studley's parents are. One more from the Iowa Census. This one is in 1905. The 1905, the 1915 were done on cards. So this doesn't look much like a card. That's because there was 2 parts to the 1905. There was one that was like an index. And there you can see George Studley again up there with Rebecca Studley. Rebecca is my ancestor, not Eliza. And Frederick Studley up there is my grandfather. So this is more like an index to it. But this is available on Ancestry. But the other part, the card's not on Ancestry. The card is available on Family Search. So I don't think any place explains that, but if you're looking at the 1905 Iowa Census, you want to look both on Family Search and Ancestry to find both parts of it. And here's the card. Okay, that kind of completes my part. Mary's going to be talking about the 1950 census next. And I think we'll take questions at the end, right?
Thanks, Gwenay. We're working on the sound here. So. Okay, we'll go from here. I think that's better. So a little over 2 months, and the 1950 census will be released. In April 1st, 2022. It will be released digitally. It won't be on microfilm. And that's the way the 1940 census was released. And it's anticipated that the big 4 sites will have the images available shortly after it's released. FamilySearch.org will be free. The Census Bureau may make images available online. I suspect they will. I don't have the URL at this time. However, the other big 3 subscription, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Find My Past, are likely to have copies of the images. People sometimes ask, why is the census released 72 years after it was taken? And the assumption is it's for privacy, or that was the life expectancy, but there's a little bit different history of that. From 1790 to 1870, the US Census records were available at the local courthouse. And so you could go in and look for them, at least in your area. However, from 1880 to 1940, census records were closed to the general public. They released statistical information, but not individual level information. The National Archives was established in 1934, and then in 1942, the Census Bureau transferred most of the records to the National Archives. Well, they made the decision to open all the records from 1790 to 1870. So from 1870 to 1942 was a span of 72 years. And that was kind of the default. It was just an agreement. It's not, at that time, it wasn't written in law and it wasn't passed by Congress, but it was an agreement between the Census Bureau and the National Archives. And so that has continued to this day. So at any rate, we're looking forward to April 1st. What's unique about the 1950 census? Well, there were 151 plus million people, residents were counted. For the first time, they enumerated Americans who were abroad, and that included members of the armed forces, crews on vessels, members of the armed forces, and then crews on vessels. Also, employees of the United States government who were living and working in foreign countries. And they also tried to do the Americans living abroad, and that would, if you were a private citizen, that was dependent on your neighbors or family reporting that there was a family member abroad. So that was probably not the most accurate. And as Gwenay mentioned in her presentation, it was the first use of a non-military computer to tabulate statistics. This is what the form looked like, and it is totally illegible in my opinion. There was no way I could enlarge it and get it on the screen. So the questions are listed in the handout that were asked in the 1950 census, and I'll be going over some of those, but you can see them at this URL. And as I say, they're listed in the handout, and the handout is in the chat. Is that right? No, it's not in chat. It what? Okay. So questions asked, all residents were only asked 24 questions. This was a reduction from 1940 when they were asked 34. And they also used sampling for the second time. And the way they kind of tried to improve it from the 1940 census, they would ask extra questions of the person, pertaining to the person on every 6th line, but so that it wasn't always number 6 or number 12, they varied the lines for each year. So you never know. Hopefully that's when you hope that your ancestors were asked the extra questions. One of the big things about a census record is finding their place of residence, because it puts your ancestor or the person you're researching in a certain place at a certain time. So normally you would have the name of the street and the house, the apartment number, street. Sometimes there was a serial number. The 1950 census asked if it was a household if it was on a farm or a ranch. If you remember, the United States was transitioning from a post-World War agricultural based population to more of an urban one. So there was this shift, and they wanted to track that. And then they asked if it was on 3 or more acres, because the suburbs were obviously developing. And the fortunate thing is they had a housing census that was on the verso, the back of the census sheet, but that wasn't microfilm. So we have lost the housing census except for the statistical data from the 1950 census. There were some general questions that were common to a lot of this censuses. You had the name, the relationship to the head of household, race, sex, age, marital status, state of county or birth, and if the person was a foreign born, are they naturalized? And then they asked some questions pertaining to people 14 and older. What was this person doing most of last week in regard to employment, working, keeping house, or something else? And if it was no, if they weren't working or keeping house or something else, were they looking for work, and what types of work? The supplemental questions asked pertain to education, and if they attended school of the highest grade completed, is the person a veteran? And of course, in 1950, there were a lot of veterans coming back from World War II, and prior residence and the birthplace of parents. And then there were supplemental questions to the supplemental questions. So a few people were asked how many years they were in their current marital status. In other words, if you're married, how many years you've been married, number of previous marriages, and for females, number of live births. And I have read that they only asked females how many live births they had if the females were married. For males, they asked them if they'd served in World War I or II. So there you get your veteran status, and that would give an indication you might want to look for further records on the veterans. And if they were previously married or widowed, and if female and ever married, how many children she'd born. But again, they didn't ask the female that if they weren't married. An interesting thing about residence, I talked about, they wanted to know where the residence, they recorded your residence. That was intended to be where you slept 4 of 7 nights. So if you were if your job caused you to travel, you would put where you were most of the time. College students, those above 18, were enumerated where they attended school. So for Iowa State, it would have been Iowa State College that at that time in 1950, they were counted as residents of Ames. But prior to 1950, college students were enumerated in their parents' homes. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind if you're researching someone of college age. And a newborn infant would be counted where the parent lived. So if the infant's still in the hospital, they'll be counted where the person lived. Or if, I don't know, if you lived in Davenport, Iowa, and you gave birth across the river in Illinois, it would be where the parents lived. And I think this is a little different too in the 1950 census. If someone was visiting your home on the day the numerator came about, they would not count that visitor or say a grandchild staying with you for a brief time, but they would count them at their normal place of residence. Then they also tried to count people who were they called it T-night, and it was to count transients and travelers, people who might be in hotels especially, and camps and so forth. So they had 2 times set aside for this on April 13th, Tuesday, and the 11th from 5 to 11 and Thursday from 7 a.m. to noon. And apparently they just did it in the hotel lobby, for example, and they would look, if the person wouldn't give the information, they would look at the hotel register. So they were trying to be as complete as they could, but there were always problems because some people don't want to, don't cooperate. At any rate, in addition to the 48 states still, because we didn't get to 50 later, they also counted people in the Panama Canal Zone and Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, and some smaller islands. So you had a more inclusive attempt to include people in the 1950s. They also try to do some improvement in accuracy. They had better training for the numerators, and they gave them more of a detailed map. And they also did kind of a quality control after the census taker turned in their report. Apparently they did a sampling of 3,500 small areas, and they re-interviewed 22,000. So it was a sort of quality control to try to make it as accurate as possible. Now I want to talk a little bit about the indexes to the census, because when you search it, the search that you enter into Ancestry or one of the other places is usually based on an index. You'll search the index box. However, when the 1940 census was released, it was just the images. There was no ready-made index. That was done by volunteers, and it took about 5 to 6 months before it was completed. Well, now things are taking a little bit of a turn. It's a little bit unclear, but the National Archives had it on their blog on December 14th of last year. They stated a new dedicated 1950 census website is being worked on and will include a name search function powered by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and optical character recognition. So something's in the works to make it a little easier by using this new or using more technology. I haven't been able to get anything definite on it, but it appears that there will be something, as they don't call it a name index, they call it a name search function. And we think that there's some speculation that they're working with volunteers, perhaps from Family Search, I can't verify that, to get this working. Nobody can see the 1950 census before it's released, but apparently by using this technology, they're trying to get some type of function where you can search for names. Now, that would not be location, it wouldn't be by age or residence, it would just be by name. So the other entries probably won't be indexed. We'll stay, as we get more information, we'll know a little bit more, but there is some speculation so that when the census is released on April 1st, that there'll be some means of searching it other than just browsing through it. And that's what I want to talk about. Well, assuming there's not, as they call it, a name search function or an index, how do you find your ancestors until it is indexed? Well, information was given, you search them by location, and the census was divided by enumeration districts, and that was the census, that was the region, an area that a single census taker was expected to do, usually in 2 weeks. Sometimes it took a little bit more, but my understanding is, according to the directions given to the census takers, they didn't get paid until they turned in their census records. So I guess there was an incentive to get around their district. But anyway, you have to go by what's called enumeration districts. And so that means you need to know the address, or maybe not the exact house number, but you need to know the area where your ancestor was living in 1950 to try to search that portion of the census. So how do you know where they were living? Well, sometimes you know because of family stories, you know because of letters, diaries, city directories would work for the larger cities, newspaper articles, family stories, obituaries, old telephone directories. I know that many libraries keep a previous directories. So if you're in a small town, you could probably ask there at the library. The Ames Public Library has a lot of early directories, so you could locate people there. It's just probably a whole search in itself, but if you can at least know the area where they're living, perhaps even the county of a state would help. As I said, the enumeration district is how the census will be divided up, and each enumeration district, and you need to know the enumeration district before you can search them in the census. So the number was made up of, each state had their own system or own numbering, and usually it was by an alphabetical list. So for example, Story County would be would probably be 85. And then the second number is a further number in that area. So, probably alphabetical. And a city with the larger cities had their own prefix number. But anyway, the fact is you need to know this. To search the census before the index is available, you need to know the enumeration district number. How do you find the enumeration district number? Well, you can go to the National Archives and Records Administration website, and I'm just going to show some screenshots here in a bit, and those are also in the handout. So you click enumeration districts and related maps, and then search within this series. And you can put the state in, and I put in Iowa. And this is what, and this is a South Dakota map. But I know, for example, that my parents were living in McCook County, South Dakota. And I can tell in the southwest part, the town called Bridgewater, they lived on a farm near there. And I can tell by the very, very faint writing on the map that they were in District 44-3. Here's a map of Ames. And again, the enumeration districts are marked out, and you can see 85 is the first one. And then the second one is, I don't know exactly how they figured that out. They just numbered up, and there were boundaries. And again, a census taker was expected to enumerate and visit all the residents in that particular enumeration district. Well, there's an easier way. You can do it for finding out the maps. There's a website called Steve Morse One Step Site, and he has a lot more than just census records on it. But for today, I'm just concentrating on census records. It's stevemorse.org, not stevemorse.com. If you do the stevemorse.com, I think you get a person plays the guitar. Just remember stevemorse.org. And again, you choose, this is what the page looks like, check US Census, and then the top one is the Unified Census Finder. And then you enter as much information as you can as far as the state, county, and the city or town. And I just put in an address of 1101 Orchard Drive. And then it will come up and show you that that's District 85-12 or Enumeration District 8512. And if you look at this map, you can see 8512 fairly close to the center of the map. And that would correspond then with that enumeration district. And that was actually, I think, the address of Stuart Smith, who was a mayor of Ames and has a park named after him. He was living on Orchard Street. So if I wanted to find the census record for him, I would go to the records and then search and scan all the pages for all the people living in District 8512. And there's one other way on the Steve Morse site. If you don't know the exact address, he'll walk you through a quiz and you enter what you do know, and then you might be able to find it, but it takes a little more time. So that one is not as easy, but again, it's worth exploring if you can't find that. So it's a great site, stevemorse.org. Take a look at it, and he also has a lot of tutorials and explanations, and he's put up some updated YouTube videos. I couldn't find an image, of course, for browsing the 1950 census because it's not available. So I'm showing you what it would look like if you were going to browse the 1940 census on Ancestry. Over to the right, you can see where it says browse this collection. From the card catalog on Ancestry, I chose the 1940 United States Federal Census. So this comes up. I can't put in, if this were the 1950 and it hadn't been indexed, I couldn't put in any information to search it, possibly the name. We don't know how that search index works. But let's say we're going to browse it. The 1950 census should look similar to this. You go over to the side and you pick the browse this collection. You put in the information you know as far as state, county, and city, and then it will give you a choice of enumeration districts. So it's not easy, but if you take it slowly, I think it's workable. One of the things that they did in the 1950 census is they wanted to ensure accuracy again. If an infant was born in the first 3 months of 1950, they filled out what was called an infant card. And so these would be a tremendous source. The only thing is they weren't kept. They were apparently tabulated and then destroyed. No one knows where they are. So maybe they'll show up like the 1800 census did. I don't know. So how do you get ready for the census? Well, first of all, if you're up at midnight, and I assume this will be Eastern time on April 1st, be prepared for sites crashing and being extremely busy. So a little patience is probably in order. But before that, if you would make a list of the persons you're going to research and who are likely to be enumerated on April 1st, and find their address as close as you can, where they living in this county or this district or whatever. If they lived in a large city, then you need to know, then you can use the Steve Morris map to map out what you do know and try to find the enumeration district. And you'll just have to be patient because it's going to be a flurry of activity. And I think I'm going to take April 1st off and wait about 10 days and try to find it after that when it's not quite so busy. So these are a few resources that are also in the handout. Renee had some really good ones of where you can find extra information about the census. So that's all I have. So I think we can take questions.
Great, thank you both.